Good evening, everyone. Hello, thank you for coming to tonight's program, The War in Ukraine. This program is a partnership between Fort Vancouver Regional Libraries and Washington State University. I'm Jamie Bear, my pronouns are they, them, and I am the experiential learning librarian for Fort Vancouver Regional Libraries. Before we start, I will let you know that because we have a rather large group here this evening, this is a webinar, so any questions you have for our panelists can be submitted using the Q&A function, and you can find that at the bottom of your screen. To minimize duplicate questions, which I'm sure there will be several, if you can see the other questions people have submitted. So if you see a question someone has submitted and you have that same question, please feel free to upvote it, which is the little thumbs up icon in the Q&A panel, and that'll help move those questions up to the top so we don't have to have the same questions over and over. Please remember that this is a library program, so the library rules of conduct apply here just as they would at a physical library program. And we are recording today's program and we will be posting it to the library's YouTube channel in the next few days. And with that, thank you from the library. Thank you to WSU. And I would like to turn things over to Dr. Mark Stephan.
Hi, thank you, Jamie. This is Mark Stephan from WSU Vancouver. The Public Affairs program. We in the Public Affairs program and from WSU overall want to thank the Fort Vancouver Regional Library for their participation in this event. We're really glad to be working with them and look forward to, well, we've worked with them in the past and we look forward to working with them in the future as well. I want to mention that the program that is also sponsoring this besides the regional library is the WSU program in Public Affairs. WSU, our program in public affairs has a bachelor's degree that is for students who want to get a training and background and potentially work in careers in public service at the local, state, federal level, who might be interested in public policy or politics more broadly. This is a great degree for them, and let us know if you have any questions about it. Well, maybe not tonight, but get in touch. So I'm really happy to introduce my colleagues from the university. Each of them will speak in turn for about 10 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A afterwards. And I know from prior experience myself that sometimes we have burning questions that we want to ask early on, for example, and we won't be able to get to them till later. And we'll do our best. We're going to be collecting all the questions that we get and trying to work with all of them and synthesize them and do our best to try to, ask, at least I'll ask as many of them as I can with the hopes that we can get as many answers to you as possible. My colleagues, I'll introduce each of them in turn to kind of get us rolling. And I'm going to start with my colleague, Anthony Lopez. Anthony is going to be talking about grievance, opportunism, and miscalculation in the Ukraine. Again, he'll be going for about 10 minutes, and then I'll do a bit of a transition and we'll move to our next speaker. Anthony, it's all yours.
Thanks a lot, Mark. So there has been this, as we're all aware by now, painfully aware perhaps, there is this song and dance regarding the question of who is to blame for the war in Ukraine. Is Putin responsible for launching an unprovoked war of aggression? Did the West poke a sleeping bear by expanding NATO into former Soviet territories, causing the bear to feel threatened and encircled? I take the middle ground. Putin's war is indeed, to a degree, a reaction to Western foreign policy, but importantly, the prism through which Vladimir Putin interprets the foreign policy of other states, including the United States and the West generally, is one of political grievance and a historic Russian territorial paranoia. Yes, Putin's war is a reaction to Western behavior, but given the diametrically opposed interests of Russia and NATO countries, Russia's invasion in what it considers its near abroad was in many ways inevitable. And this characterization of the conflict, by the way, forces us to ask a more specific question, not just why the invasion occurred, but why now? The answer to that question comes in three parts: grievance, opportunism, and miscalculation. The first part is grievance. Vladimir Putin has publicly, loudly bemoaned the territorial disintegration of the Soviet Union as the most important strategic blunder of his lifetime. But he's no communist. Vladimir Putin is a nationalist seeking to steer Russia toward renewed great power status while keeping the humiliation of the 1990s firmly in the rearview mirror. This vision is incompatible with the loss of territory to NATO and the steady march of pro-democratic color revolutions that Putin is convinced can only be interpreted as a long-term, well-funded Western plot to unseat him. I think we also have to combine this political memory, which perhaps colors the view of many Russian elites, with the unique psychology of Putin himself. Scholarly opinion is fairly united on Putin. We know he is a socially conservative, former KGB analyst at the center of an increasingly isolated, autocratic political system. Putin has proven himself to be a calculating, but also risk-acceptant leader who is highly motivated to establish a political legacy of reversing the political mistakes of his country's past. For example, a leading index of political risk-taking places Vladimir Putin among the top 10% of leaders in history most likely to start an armed conflict. He's turning 70 this year, and he's thinking carefully about his legacy. Grievance and personal psychology has fueled the rivalry, and a tragic combination of opportunity and miscalculation have convinced Vladimir Putin that this is an ideal and necessary time to strike. In terms of opportunity, Putin's perspective on the previous decade is one of a growing strings of foreign policy successes and Western misadventures. For example, in 2008, his war against Georgia not only crippled Georgia's hopes of deeper NATO partnership, but also caught Western leaders completely by surprise and without clear or united response. In 2014, in response to what Putin viewed as a Western coup, Putin quickly, quietly, and successfully annexed Crimea, which was a very popular move within Russia, and again, very confusing to Western leaders as to how best to respond. In 2015, Russia demonstrated that it could project power beyond its near abroad into Syria, as it successfully propped up the Assad regime against local and pro-Western forces during this civil war. In 2016, Putin demonstrated that he could stoke chaos in the heart of American democracy itself, literally celebrating as Americans became increasingly polarized over these and future election results. More broadly, the European Union has been struggling with economic and political instability, and despite NATO's expansion into Eastern Europe since the end of the Cold War, the military alliance has found itself largely without strategic compass and an American president that seemed willing to question its very commitment to the alliance. All of these factors conspired to allow Putin to read the political landscape as one of opportunity and permissiveness. In short, the West was weak and divided, while Russia was resurgent and riding a wave of foreign policy successes. Finally, this optimistic opportunism fueled a set of miscalculations that tipped the scales into action. First, as Putin has been reminding us for over a decade, Ukraine is not even a real country. And in part because of this, Ukrainians would not only fail to resist Russian advancements, but would instead welcome them as liberators. This is a miscalculation that, by the way, Americans should be very familiar with. And second, the hapless surrender of Kyiv would happen so quickly, according to Putin, that NATO would again be caught on the back foot and at best forced to negotiate from a position of weakness, or at worst, continue to stumble upon its own divisions. In short, the miscalculation that was Ukraine 2022 would be Crimea 2014 all over again. All of these miscalculations turn out to be wrong. Or I should say, all of these calculations turn out to be miscalculations. Putin has overestimated the readiness, morale, and training of his own troops. He has underestimated the Ukrainians in this regard, and he himself has been on the back foot regarding control of the global narrative and information warfare. As these miscalculations become apparent into the second month of the war, Putin is seeking now to regroup and reframe the war as one of limited aims focused on the Donbas region in eastern Ukraine. Many analysts believe that the focus here is in part to shift the battlefield to one that is relatively more advantageous for Russian troops, namely the relatively open rural landscape of eastern Ukraine. Consequently, many are expecting the second phase of this war to look more like a conventional battlefield than a counterinsurgency. In this regard, it's noteworthy that Putin has placed General Alexander Dvornikov, popularly known as the Butcher of Syria, in charge of the Ukraine offensive. It's noteworthy for a couple of reasons. First, again, Putin is proud of the Syrian campaign and is trying to draw on expertise from that conflict to help shore up losses in this one. Second, his battlefield history suggests Russia is committed to fighting an extended, dirty war to hold this territory, even at great cost. In this regard, it's important to remember that this is, historically speaking, the Russian way of war. Many have been surprised at the operational blunders of the Russian military in this opening phase of the war, but Russian warfare is built on attrition, designed to overwhelm with relative numbers and with time. In this regard, one should not forget Stalin's famous dictum that quantity has a quality all its own. Unfortunately for Russia, however, the reality of the war right now is that Putin is struggling with both. And with that, I'll hand it over to Mark Stefan and look forward to your questions in the rest of the forum.
Thanks, Anthony. And thanks for getting us started with a particular perspective of the Russian government and of Putin in particular, and thinking about how we got to this point with Ukraine. It's a reminder of something I should have said before, which is that we have with us 3 political scientists, 1 historian who's going to talk next, and they bring a variety of perspectives, different angles at thinking about the Ukraine situation. So if you have particular questions about their talks or broader questions that you're hoping that we get into, do let us know in the Q&A. We'll do our best to answer. I'm now going to turn it over to my colleague from history, from Karl Krotke-Crandall, and he will be talking about the language of war, demystifying Putin's De-Nazification. I can't even say the word, De-Nazification of Ukraine through the Soviet historical lens. So again, a historical approach. Take it away, Karl.
Thank you, Mark. During the early morning hours of February 24th, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin addressed the Russian people to announce a special military operation in Ukraine. And much has been made by pundits in the media during the early days of the unwarranted war by Putin's remarks and justifications for the conflict by highlighting his predetermined guilt to Ukrainian nationalists and neo-Nazis seeking to clash with Russia. Since the opening days of the war, Putin's political cronies and the head of the Russian Orthodox Church, Patriarch Kirill, have taken to the airwaves in support of this denazifying campaign in Ukraine. Many reporters assumed that this was a reference to Azov, a far-right military regiment that has engaged Russian troops since the 2014 occupation of Crimea. However, I believe that by looking at the Soviet past, that we can see that Putin is pulling an old scheme out of the USSR playbook to resonate with a captive audience in Russia. The scholars in the West have quickly pointed out the flaws and historical inaccuracies of Putin's initial address. They argue against his linkage of the contemporary Azov as misrepresenting the history of World War II, Ukraine, and those who had sided with the Nazis. To be clear, such a connection by Putin does misrepresent the historical realities. Ukrainians did fight on both sides of the war, as did Poles and Russians. Those who sided with the Nazis more often did so to throw off the yoke of Soviet oppression. Now, contemporary Ukrainian citizens do express political ideologies from the far right to the left, and Azov is frequently featured in the press because some members are extreme in their support for the alternate right, some even tattooing themselves with the symbols of the Nazis. The defense forces of Ukraine did incorporate Azov members into their ranks to thwart off the Russian invasion, and their leadership claims to be working to remove elements of far-right ideology within the forces. But why does the government of Ukraine allow this behavior? Well, because they're attempting to establish themselves as a modern democracy, which provides space for expression across the political spectrum. And before anyone in the US chooses to judge Ukraine, they might look in the mirror to see the similarities between our two nations. I would argue that Putin's regime is one of distraction. Media outlets like to proclaim that he plays a game of three-dimensional chess, but I would argue that he's actually overseeing a game of hungry, hungry hippo in which he drops pieces of information waiting for the press to gobble it up in a flurry to distract us from what might be his alternative objectives. For example, in the months and weeks leading up to the war in Ukraine, we witnessed reports in a bevy of ways about new and contradictory policies targeting foreign nationals, such as the required quarterly medical exams. Then came the liquidation of Memorial International, the human rights organization that was founded during the Soviet Union to uncover past atrocities by the Soviet government and then to protect human rights during conflict in and around Russia. To me, this appears to be a media cover for the movement of for troops into Belarus and the staging of the war. And after a month of conflict in Ukraine, the tide began to turn against Russia, and the media was once again distracted by the following headline-grabbing story of a new trial against Alexei Navalny. What was Putin taking our eyes away from this time? Perhaps it was the massacre at Bucha. And just this afternoon, reports have surfaced of the arrest of the opposition politician Vladimir Kara-Murza. And perhaps this is another distraction from the simultaneous accounts that are emerging out of Mariupol by Ukrainian soldiers who are encountering chemical weapons. So with Putin the distractor in mind, let's return to his speech of February 24th and unpack what isn't making it into the analyses of our journalists. In reviewing the transcript of Putin's February 24th speech, the topic of Nazism that flooded our airwaves is not the top agenda item. The majority of this address, nearly 16 of the 27 minutes, has little to do with Ukraine, but instead focuses on NATO expansion. And some might contend that Putin is intimating that Ukraine will join NATO, which is the fear of expansion he might be getting at. But if that were the case, he would say that explicitly in the speech, and he doesn't because he knows this is a far-off reality. But if we dig deeper into his anti-NATO sentiments, we can see that he is describing a type of perhaps neo-American imperialism. Putin begins by laying out the discourse on NATO and NATO expansion to the border of Russia. He states, quote, "It is coming closer to our borders. After the collapse of the USSR, the realignment of the world began, and the norms of international law that had been developed began to get in the way of the self-proclaimed winner of the Cold War," end quote. In this estimation, Putin's statement clarifies that further changes to the New World structure were and presently are at the behest of the United States. On the European continent, that proxy to Putin is NATO. From this point in the speech, Putin then turns to a list of circumstances that, quote, "they see fit," meaning the United States, to intervene in international events. He names Serbia, Iraq, Libya, and Syria as examples in which NATO, and by extension the United States, engaged in an illegal conflict, according to Putin's assessment. While Putin's comments might appear shocking, misrepresentational, and perhaps even puzzling, these arguments are nothing new. As I regularly tell my students, current events do not occur in a vacuum. There is a history behind it. And sure enough, Putin's proclamation of American imperialism, exuding itself through NATO expansion, and the incorporation of Nazism is a hallmark of Soviet propaganda that began with Joseph Stalin. On November 6th, 1941, roughly 5 months following the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union during Operation Barbarossa, Stalin addressed attendees at an event in Moscow. In his remarks, Stalin linked the Nazis with the Black Hundred. This is an ultra-nationalist pro-Romanov group known for anti-Semitism, anti-Ukrainian sentiment, and violent pogroms. Stalin's connection between the autocrat supporting and by extension imperialistic Romanov monarchy to Nazism became a regular feature during the Cold War in the propaganda of the Soviet Union. From the onset of the Cold War, the United States did engage in the Truman Doctrine to contain the geopolitical spread of communism. Our nation engaged in overt military campaigns and covert proxy wars to ensure the containment of the Soviets. And on their end, the Soviets took their newspapers to eviscerate the United States and their allies who engaged in such conflicts by using Stalin's past linguistic analogy. For example, during the 1967 Arab-Israeli Six-Day War, the Soviet presses criticized the state of Israel for engaging in a war against its Soviet-backed Arab neighbors. To simplify the message to the Russian audience, the Soviets employed political cartoons to describe Israeli aggression as an extension of American imperialism and called Israeli leaders Nazis. These images regularly featured Israeli soldiers dressed as Nazi stormtroopers marching into conflict at the direction of a nameless capitalist American. Moshe Dayan, the Israeli Minister of Defense, was often depicted as Hitler. In one extreme example, Soviet propagandists depicted Dayan as picking up the baton of genocide from a skeletal arm stretching out of a swastika. Set against the backdrop is always the coding of a warning against American imperialism. And President Putin once again reminded his audience on February 24th of the, quote, so-called policy of containment of Russia, which brings geopolitical benefits, end quote, meaning to the United States. Lastly, we should consider why Putin re-engages with old rhetoric of the Soviet past. We must remember who is his audience, because it's not you or I. I don't personally believe that Putin considers outside opinions when he takes his actions. He cares about remaining in power by maintaining authority and legitimacy to the Russian people. He will pander, manipulate, or hold hostage those living within the borders of the Russian Federation to ensure these aims. Putin's address was to the, quote, respected citizens of Russia. This phrase is another coded message meaning Putin's supporters, and I'm not speaking to those specifically in his inner circle or those that he pays to enforce his draconian laws. I'm referring specifically to those Russians who are stuck in their apartments during the cold winter nights, only able to view Putin's state-run television programming. Day after day, the forced indoctrination of Russian citizens occurs by limiting their access to the outside world and infusing their news with deliberate propaganda that engages in a moment of Russian history, the Great Patriotic War, or what we know as World War II. To Russians, this war is significant to their psyche. It represents incredible suffering, loss, and victory over fascism. Every year, in the weeks leading up to Victory Day on May 9th, Russians begin to wear orange and black ribbons to remember this event. And while we might see the parade of military vehicles in Red Square as the flexing of Russia's military might, average citizens might remember that this is their nation's sacrifice in defeating the Nazis. Putin's choice to co-opt the language of the Great Patriotic War in his address was a deliberate scheme to ensure the support of an audience that is held hostage in his political police state. Thank you.
Karl, thanks. Before we turn to our next speaker, I just want to mention that, Anthony talked about how Putin really wants to keep sort of the fall of the Soviet Union in the rearview mirror, but clearly he's bringing his toolbox with him from the Soviet period in terms of, the stuff that Karl just talked about in terms of propaganda and the use of language, and also the cultural sort of touchstones that he tries to connect with. Thank you. Our next speaker is Carolyn Long, another one of the professors from WSU Vancouver. She will be speaking about Putin's War, a view from the Balkans. Go to it, Carolyn. Can't hear you.
Thanks, Mark. And I have put myself off of the video because of connectivity issues. So happy to join you. Let me begin by saying that my views expressed today do not reflect the views of Washington State University or the Fulbright organization. I'm a Fulbright scholar at the University of Ljubljana in Slovenia right now. And so I really welcomed this opportunity to bring a comparative perspective being in the Balkans right now during this conflict. So obviously Putin's war is a terrible crisis, both militarily and economically. Europe is suffering financially. We have seen that expressed in the surging energy and food prices and commodity prices. Inflation is at a 40-year high in Europe at 7.5%, which is similar to the United States. And many people call this war Europe's worst crisis since World War II. But I would suggest that many are forgetting the Balkans War following the disintegration of the former Yugoslavia, in a war in which 120,000 lives were lost, which is tragic and was very recent in our political history. Also, people are forgetting about the Kosovo conflict when it sought independence at the end of the 20th century and its conflict with Serbia. And that is still an ongoing concern as well. And the reason why I mention this is that if you look at the Western Balkans, it remains quite vulnerable to crises that are happening in Eastern Europe, and in particular, what's happening in Ukraine. So as Russia continues to accelerate its invasion of Ukraine, there are concerns politically, economically, about what this means for the Western Balkan region. And if you speak to people here in the Balkans, which I have, you still see the remnants of the terrible situation 30 years ago, and the concern of spillover effects in the Balkan region. There's less of a concern that Putin will directly invade some of the Balkan countries, and more of a concern that what will happen is, because of the crisis and the uncertainty of where Putin is going to go, that it will have spillover effects in some of these countries, providing an opportunity for leaders there to actually instigate a crisis of their own. So just a couple of brief comments before I talk about three countries in particular, which is that it's important to keep in mind that Bosnia, Serbia, and Kosovo are the only remaining Balkan states that have not joined NATO. And these are also states where Moscow has interests and proxies that act on its behalf. And then, of course, Serbia and Belarus have not joined the EU in sanctions against Putin. Bosnia was also part of the two, but through an interesting way of doing it, they also condemned, they eventually condemned what Putin was doing. So speakers have already talked about main issues being EU expansion and NATO expansion in these regions. And so it really does sort of highlight why this becomes sort of an area where there will be great concern about potential conflict. And of course, when we're talking about NATO, we're speaking about military commitment. And then for EU expansion, we're talking about how economically these countries can benefit. So just a quick reminder before I talk about Bosnia, Kosovo, and Serbia. The Bosnian War was triggered by Yugoslavia collapsing after the collapse of the Soviet Union. It was previously a federation of socialist states made up of republics, and they ended up sort of sectioning off. And there are various ethnic groups in each one of the republics. It actually started in Slovenia, where I'm at now, but it was quite a limited conflict, but became quite major in both Bosnia and also Croatia, where many of these lives were lost. Interestingly, Bosnia and its seeking of independence from Serbia has been used by Putin to justify the war in Ukraine. So Serbia had argued that Bosnia sort of didn't exist, that the Bosnian identity was bogus, and therefore it should be part of Serbia. And so you see similarities to what's happening in Ukraine. And of course, the Serbian strongman Milosevic had this idea of a greater Serbia, which envisioned occupying and annexing Bosnia. What happened is we see a terrible siege in Sarajevo, and then the war ultimately ends after NATO bombing sort of stopped the conflict, and then it was frozen by the Dayton Peace Agreement. And the reason why this is important is that agreement really allowed Bosnia to be governed by 3 members of a federal presidency representing each of the ethnic groups, including Bosnian Serbs, and that becomes important in a moment. And then a quick reminder about the war in Kosovo. We had a situation where there was genocide that was occurring. Kosovo ends up seceding against away from Serbia. And then Russia, of course, was arguing that that secession, much like what happened with Yugoslavia, was a precedent that could trigger what it's doing in Ukraine. So it's really important to look at what happened in the Balkans and how it's being used as justification for Putin's war. So I just briefly want to talk about Serbia, Bosnia, and then also Kosovo. So today, Serbia wants to join the EU, but it also benefits strongly from its relationship with Moscow. Serbia, of course, is surrounded by EU and NATO members, and so Moscow's relationship with Serbia is very important. Serbia is a staunch ally of Putin, That is, of course, reflected in the fact that while they condemned what was happening in Ukraine, they haven't joined those EU sanctions. And that's significant because you're seeing them as an outlier in terms of the Balkan countries. The president has also ordered the military and the police to be prepared and in a state of readiness, just in case something breaks out. So you see a little bit of a heightening of tensions there. And of course, Serbia, like many Balkan countries, is very reliant on Russia, both for energy and also in Serbia, the local media is financed by Russia. So you get to see a little bit of propaganda that's occurring in terms of how the conflict is being portrayed. And Serbian authorities really also see Russians as allies, or some have called Slavic brothers. And so there is that affinity towards them. And the other thing I would mention is that there's a really strong link between the Serbian and the Russian Orthodox churches, which remains an instrument of Russia's influence in the region. If you look at Bosnia, as I mentioned previously, Bosnia is governed by 3 presidents. And the Bosnian Serbs comprise about 30% of the population, about half of the landmass. And it is being governed right now by a Serb member of the presidency, Milorad Dodik, who has very close links to the Kremlin, who has really been threatening to withdraw their part of Bosnia from the Bosnia-Herzegovina region. And in fact, Dodik in the last several months has created a very new judiciary, tax system, institutions of governance, even an army, in order to start that, let's call it a march towards independence. And the concern in Bosnia is that he's taking advantage of the fact that the West is focused on Ukraine to actually seek that independence. And he is being, at least indirectly, if not directly, encouraged by Russia. And Dodik, as part of this federation of presidents, has the opportunity to veto any of the actions that are occurring in terms of the government wanting to do anything in regard to Ukraine. And so they will continue to be an outlier. And, you know, he represents over 1 million people and half of the region of Bosnia. And so if this were to happen, it would significantly affect that part of the area. Then I would also mention that Moscow's ambassador has mentioned that if Bosnia were to join NATO, that they would respond. They would respond to it as a threat. So mimicking what somebody mentioned earlier, that's why the NATO ascension is so important. Second, if you look at Kosovo today, you're looking at a situation where the area is fairly unstable. It's really a protectorate of the UN. It doesn't have strong governing forces. But more importantly, if you look at Kosovo, it is in an area where there is bound to be conflict. You have the secession that happened earlier in 2008, where they achieved independence, and they are trying, in fact, to be a NATO partner, as well as joining the EU, despite the fact that some countries have not recognized their independence. And Putin has also been very concerned about what's happening in Kosovo, both because of the Serb population, but also because he sees it as an opportunity to justify what he has done in Crimea and now in Ukraine. And so what you see in Kosovo and Bosnia is really heightened tensions, a tremendous amount of concern about what's happening globally. And with Serbia, you see this connection to Russia and their unwillingness to really go along with the rest of the EU in terms of its condemnation of what's happening in Ukraine. And then let me just end by mentioning that other countries in the Balkans are also at potential risk. Montenegro had a pro-Serbian leader that failed recently. North Macedonia, we see increasing Russian influence. And then, of course, in Albania, we have seen the use of U.S. special forces recently because of destabilization in Kosovo. So it is a tinderbox. It is where a conflict will spread, not again, Russia invading the Balkans, but Russian invasion of Ukraine, creating uncertainty, which may then lead to conflict in the Balkans, which has suffered so many losses over the last 20 and 30 years. And I'll end there, and I look forward to questions in the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Carolyn. Really interesting stuff. And that the Balkans perspective, you've clearly informed me about a lot of stuff that I've not been tracking in terms of the recent tensions across the entire Balkans and its relationship to the Ukraine situation. Let's go ahead and finish then with Paul Thiers. He's going to talk for 10 minutes, and let me give his title for his talk, and then we'll be opening it up for questions. We've been absorbing your questions, trying to make sense of them and sort them as best we can, and we'll hopefully leave as much time as possible for that. My colleague, Paul, will talk about geopolitical, economic, and energy security impacts of the conflict. Take it away, Paul.
Thank you, Mark, and thank you, everybody. We're reaching the end of the formal presentations, and I see some great questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to actually try and keep it pretty short. Just to make sure I'm close, I'm actually starting a timer too. I mainly just really want to use some of the sanctions and some of the response to the sanctions and potential countermeasures to try and kind of contextualize the geopolitical changes that we're seeing that will impact both the short-term effectiveness of the sanctions and potentially endgame for this conflict, as well as some broader structural changes that we might see going forward because of this. We've really seen sanctions that have structural implications in three areas. There are, of course, sanctions against individuals, but I think what's really important is to think about sanctions that cause shifts in political, economic, or even cultural structuring of the world. So sanctions limiting Russia's ability to use the global economic and financial system, sanctions limiting Russia's ability to profit from energy exports, which have begun but could be substantially ratcheted up, and then sanctions limiting Russia's ability to import technology from sanctioning nations. And also, and this is important in all of these areas, but particularly obvious in the technology field, the sanctions also apply to third parties where technology exported to Russia includes sanctioned components. For instance, Chinese technology, which includes US or German technology that is under contract and covered by the sanctions. In each of these cases, there's, I think, two really important geopolitical questions. One, can allies agree to what sanctions, when, and for how long? And that's underway. And of course, we'll see continued negotiations and crossroads about that as the conflict proceeds and even as it ends. At what point are sanctions lifted? I saw somebody in the Q&A make reference to, a golden bridge for Putin and what will be the potential for ramping down. In all of those areas, what we've really seen that I think is of tremendous geopolitical importance is not only Europe holding together, which was certainly open to question, Europe holding together with American participation. One might even say American leadership, though I'm not sure that that captures everything at all. But the fact that the sanctions are being imposed in consort, in coordination, well over 50% of the world's economic power, I think more like about 63%, and that the participants, especially the European participants, have shown a significant willingness to sacrifice, because of course sanctions, almost by definition, if there are economic measures, they are of benefit to both sides, and therefore sanctions will have negative impact on both sides. The willingness of Europeans to sacrifice, we've seen this also in the treatment of refugees and so on, is I think one of the most remarkable long-term consequences of this conflict. It might be quite premature to say the EU is back. Maybe we want to wait for the French runoff. Maybe we want to wait for the election in Slovenia, where Carolyn is. We want to wait for a lot of milestones, of course, but the initial question of whether or not Europe would hold together in a functional way, whether or not it would do so in concert with the United States, I think we've got a firm answer in the affirmative already. The second big question is about non-allied nations and whether they will self-sanction or if they will take countermeasures. Self-sanction is a way of thinking about a non-participating, a country that is not participating in a sanctions regime, but may, for several reasons, choose to abide by sanctions, or at least not to undermine them. The best example of this right now is of course China, which is really soft pedaling its participation and its aid to Russia in undermining the economic and energy related sanctions. And especially the technology sanctions. Why it's doing that, those are really interesting questions. But China appears to be proceeding very cautiously in terms of directly undermining Western sanctions. On the other hand, we also see evidence of countermeasures, that is to say, aiding the Russian economy, aiding the Russian government. We might have time later to talk about weapons sales and so on. I saw a little bit of that in the questions, but to try and keep it focused on the economics first, I just wanted to maybe use energy as an example. Let's see how I'm doing on time here. Energy is very interesting. Of course, it's hugely important. I think most of the participants here, most of the audience will be fairly up on the news and will have some sense of the oil and natural gas export dependence or import dependence of many European countries, and the tremendous importance of oil and gas exports to the Russian economy. Probably also aware, but maybe I should mention a little bit, that there is a substantial room for the West to ratchet up the sanctions against Russian energy exports. Coal has been the first, and certainly because that is the least damaging to the Western economies. They can get coal from elsewhere. They're phasing out coal anyway due to climate change. But as natural gas and oil can be included, that's where we really start to see the impact on the Russian economy. The most significant issue, I think, would be opportunities for Russia to export oil that is currently being exported to Europe. And in that context, China is, of course, very important. The key piece of infrastructure is the ESOP, the ESPO, the Eastern Siberia Pacific Ocean Pipeline, which can handle about 35 million metric tons per year and is currently contracted at about 30. So there is some substantial room to up that. The Chinese, who are on the receiving end of that pipeline, although they are also a flow-through point for oil to be exported by ship, but primarily to Chinese refineries. The pipeline ends in Daqing, the old Chinese oil fields, where a lot of refining capacity is. The Chinese government has made no moves to increase their buy from Russia. That's the big state-owned oil companies. But we have seen so-called teapot refineries. These are privately or quasi-public-private, sometimes they're owned by a local government, oil refineries in China. A few years ago, China allowed these companies for the first time to start importing crude oil for their own purposes. And we have seen a substantial uptick in those contracts. They're far less transparent, so it's much harder to tell if, in fact, this is Russian oil. It's harder to tell how much of it is actually new. But also, for those familiar with the Chinese system, I think you can understand how it's also not a safe bet that this is entirely private action. In fact, it appears that the Chinese government is encouraging, perhaps even directing these technically non-state refineries to increase their contracts for Russian oil. That provides a good example, and I'm just going to finish up pretty quickly here, of what are we seeing from the non-allied nations, those who have expressed substantial sympathy for Putin's invasion and seem to have an interest in seeing Russia be successful in this conflict. We see in the oil contracts and in a lot of other evidence some real indication that China and some other nations, most importantly India, are substantially interested in supporting Russia and helping to undermine the sanctions. How far that will go, how public it will become, are really important questions. At this point, China is being very cautious. I think that originally, if the war had gone very, very quickly, it would have been clear to them what to do, but it's very hard for the Communist Party of China to decide at this point, how wedded do we want to be to this conflict? What can we do without being too transparent about it to support Russia? We've seen evidence of that in weapons transfers. This very recent delivery, that's my time up, I'm just going to wrap up here. This very recent delivery of surface-to-air anti-missile system to Serbia. As Caroline mentioned, Serbia is pretty clear within Europe, other than Belarus, the most supportive of the invasion. And this is a system similar to Patriot missiles or the Russian S-300s. It's a little shorter range, but similar. That was done in a very, very public way. I think a signal to the West that if the conflict does broaden, if it goes on for a long time, that China would potentially be taking sides in a more public way. But the last thing I just wanted to mention is that the really clear evidence is in the information war and in the propaganda, both in China and also in India. Though the structures to get this message through are very, very different. In China, it's very straightforward, one-party dictatorship, total control over the media. We're seeing, for instance, a dramatic increase, like many hundreds of times, in the use of the word Nazi in Chinese media. And this includes media that goes beyond China. So in a way, this is a support to Russia by circumventing sanctions or counter disinformation techniques from the West. China is certainly helping Russia to get its propaganda message out. And I think the same could be said for India. I'm out of time, so I'll stop. I see great questions there, and I hope we can get as many of them in as we can. Sorry for going a little long. Thanks, Mark.
Sure, Paul. So Paul brings us to the geopolitical level, connecting some of the same conversations we've had with our other three speakers to the broader sort of European Union, US perspectives, the non-aligned, thinking about India and China, and sort of adds that into the mix. I have been looking at questions as our regional library, our Fort Vancouver Regional Library host, Jamie, and I am starting to group them. I mean, Jamie, you're welcome to jump in as well. I'm starting to group the questions in my mind, but we're going to do our best to get through as many of these as possible. And I'm gonna combine some of them in ways that may not make you happy, but that's the way it is, right? Trying to get at this and to kind of start at the beginning again. I think I'm going to start with some questions that are mainly for Anthony, but anybody else can jump in. But then I'm going to try to hold everyone to pretty quick answers so that we can move through other questions. So I'm going to start back with Putin and Putin's mindset about all of this. And so there are two key questions that came in early on related to this. The first one was, is there any way that Putin's isolation can be sort of broken down, that it could wear away, and that he and the rest of the Kremlin could sort of be in touch with the rest of the world on some level, or is that mindset going to just continue? That was that first part of that question. And the second part has to do with why maybe help clarify why in particular now to invade the Ukraine? Why not previous years? You know, what in particular was sort of the thing, as far as you know, that brought us to this moment right now?
I'd actually be very curious to hear Karl's thoughts on the issue of Putin's mindset with respect to his relative isolation. So I'm gonna demur on that one and skip to the timing question. Timing is it's a really hard thing to answer. We're all, I think, social scientists here on the panel, and we struggle regularly in research and in policy with questions of why things happen at the specific moment they do. We're much better at being able to identify propensities, tendencies, likelihoods. And from that regard, we can say that the timing was propitious for an attack in 2021, 2022. Why it happened at the specific time it did, the season that it did, the month that it did, the day that it did, the more fine-grained of an answer you want, the harder it is to give you one. But if I'm looking for what I would say is the most proximate trigger, it would probably be, maybe I'd look to something like in June of 2020, when Ukraine is admitted to NATO as it's given enhanced opportunities partner status. And this is, one of the things that NATO has, that's got sort of like grades of relationship between itself and member states. And so it's not like you're either part of member or you're part of NATO or you're not. There are degrees of closeness, degrees of interaction between states and NATO. So, for example, in 2020, in June of 2020, the NATO recognized Ukraine as an enhanced opportunities partner. And why that's significant is because what it does is it facilitates what's called the interoperability of Ukrainians military with NATO military. It means that there's going to be basically a lot more Western military walking around within Ukraine. There's going to be a lot more joint exercises between NATO and Ukraine. And as we know, this is a bit of a red line for Putin, and it has been for some time. And so I think that at least if we are focusing on NATO as a kind of trigger, and I think we have good reasons to be suspicious that it's all about NATO. I'm not willing to put all my cards in that deck in terms of an explanation. But if we are looking at that as one of the conditions that has caused Putin to be very aggressive and assertive regarding Ukraine, I would look to its joining NATO as an enhanced opportunities partner in 2020. And, by the way, if you think about it, if you're going to start a large scale military mobilization, generally you want that sort of thing to happen in early spring. And large scale military mobilizations take a long time. And we can see that the footprint for this mobilization began as early as spring of 2021. So this was on Putin's mind not long after, historically speaking, Ukraine gained this status. So I think that alone doesn't explain it. I think, again, as I would reiterate from my talk, I think these sort of specific events combined with Putin's optimistic overconfidence, basically, given his view of himself as being relatively successful and feared in terms of hybrid warfare and these sorts of things, and the view from Putin that the West is divided and likely to be further divided as he provides them with this fait accompli, I think just gave Putin all the green lights he needed to act when he did.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. Karl, please.
I've been sitting here thinking about the whole isolation question and whether or not there's a solution, I guess, and I think of it more in terms of Russia as a whole. Would it be great if they could find a way to reintegrate in, and whether or not that's going to happen under Putin, I have a sense that perhaps maybe not. And granted, I'm a historian. We typically don't try to project into the future, but I think if anything that symbolizes the notion of isolation that we continue to see with the nation of Russia, it's Putin's personal isolation himself. If we think about since the onset of this conflict, since protests started erupting on the streets of Moscow, the first thing he did was set up a mile-wide circumference barricade around the Kremlin. You cannot get in without engaging with military police. There is a complete disconnect that is going on between the Kremlin and the Russian citizens that would love, I'm sure, to have some sort of representational government. But then we can take that even more narrow approach. We look at Putin's own physical distancing. There's been a lot of talk about maybe he's COVID paranoid or whatever. But there's clearly something has changed in his personality to put him in a situation, or put him in situations where he chooses to physically distance himself, just from even his own people, the inner workings of the Kremlin. And there's also questions about who's actually running the Kremlin at this point. If Putin has actually started to disengage from the day-to-day governance of the country, it's earned enough money at this point to have castles off wherever he chooses to be at. So there are still questions circulating around who's really running the show. If perhaps this is a sign of a disintegration of the central control of Putin and the government. There's just a lot of questions. I'm not entirely sure we're ever going to get a full answer until I think this entire situation has concluded, and we can, as a historian, get into the archives and figure out what was really going on.
Great, thank you, Karl. A lot of good questions came in. I'm actually going to sort of jump around a little bit, because this next question, since Anthony brought Karl in on this, I'm going to bring Paul and Carolyn in on the whole sort of question about China. So one of the questions that came in through the Q&A was, was China part of the thinking for the Russians, for Putin, in going into Ukraine? Like, that was basically, I think, implied in here, was Putin relying on China as, if not an ally, then certainly someone pretty close to that. And then we connect that to the weapons sort of issue with Serbia, and the Chinese supplying weapons to Serbia. That seems to create some connections across all three that are worth commenting on. So Paul first, and then Carolyn maybe.
Okay, great. I think maybe I'll touch on the second one first, just real quickly, and then Carolyn can bring that back in. I think that the weapons transfer to Serbia, which was a contract ordered 2 years ago, shouldn't be overestimated. I think it's a symbolic act. If we get to the point where an anti-missile system in Serbia is significant in the conflict is already 10 nations wide. But I think as a symbolic statement of potential support in an anti-NATO military posture, that's probably all you need to see in it. I am interested in the role of Serbia as a sort of an anti-NATO element in Europe, and I think Hungary similarly politically. But the first question about China, and specifically, I think there we mean Xi Jinping and the Politburo and their relations with the Kremlin and Putin specifically. I think that there was certainly consultation. Probably some fairly strong indication that the invasion would probably take place. Probably some assurance from Putin that the invasion would be short and quick and over. And probably some discussion of support in countermeasures against sanctions, specifically probably what to do about the banking system and the credit card system if Russia was excluded, because China has these alternative, much lower quality and size, but these alternatives that Russia is now trying to make use of. We have to remember, even before the conflict, the Chinese economy is 9 times the size of the Russian economy. By now, it's probably 10 or 11 times the size of the Russian economy. Russia is a minor, Russia is Indonesia to China economically, or Brazil, right? Significant, but not a major player. And so China can do a tremendous amount to help Russia survive whatever sanctions Putin might have seen as coming. Was there an explicit green light? I don't know. I think also from the perspective of the Chinese Communist Party and Xi Jinping in particular, there's tremendous interest in seeing what happens to Putin as they learn lessons about American and Western resolve that might help in making a decision about Taiwan, which is a whole nother subject and not really the purpose for us being here today, but I'd love for us to maybe get a chance to talk about that at some point, because it's absolutely fascinating. But I better stop there and see what Carolyn wants to say about.
Yeah.
I'm interested in Taiwan as well. I just want to speak briefly about Serbia. I'll defer to Paul on the weapons issue, and just mention that, you know, Serbia is really anti-NATO. They remember quite strongly the bombing that took place at the end of the century when the Kosovo conflict was happening. You still see burned out buildings in Belgrade, and so they are very concerned about the fact that they are surrounded by these NATO countries. I don't see that Serbia is going to play a role militarily. As Paul said, if we get to that point, things have gone very, very far. But I do want to mention that if you look at European elections, which are going on this season, I think it's had an effect on the way leaders are reacting to what's happening in Ukraine. I mean, even Orban in Hungary sort of lightly denounced what Putin was doing, as did the Serbian president. And so you see them sort of walking a tightrope in terms of their actual response. Even in Slovenia, Janja, who also condemned what was happening in Ukraine, he's a far right leader here in Slovenia. He's got illiberal tendencies like Orban. You know, he really denounced what was happening, and he's got an election happening in a couple of weeks. And so I think that there's some electoral consequences on how the leaders are reacting to what's happening in Ukraine. So it's a little bit off topic, but I do think we need to watch out for Serbia, given its role as an instigator of regional conflicts, given the fact that the leader has these tight ties to Russia, and the fact that they're really walking a tightrope. They want to belong to the EU for economic reasons, but militarily they have a connection to Russia. So they're really in a tough spot. The leader's in a tough spot, but he was just reelected. And so he may have a little bit more freedom to let his true intentions be known as we move forward.
Okay. Thank you, Carolyn. Again, really good questions from our audience. Some of them at a level of detail that I'm not sure if we're going to just ever be able to get to. But there is there's a thread. There's actually two different threads, which I'm going to sort of try to draw out. We're here until 7:30, so we've got 23 minutes. So I'm going to at least ask these two big questions. One of them at the very end, I'm going to leave time for, and that's everyone's perspective about what's the end game here. Like, how does this fall out at this point? But that's for a few minutes from now. Right now, a number of the members of the audience asked, why haven't the European Union and the US done more? Like, why not a no-fly zone? Why not help the Ukrainians more? They're civilians, that our government, is basically saying war crimes, and so many other governments are saying the same, and yet we are not doing something. A number of the audience members were like, what's going on with this? So if anybody wants to try to jump in on that one, I'd appreciate that.
Anthony, you want that, or shall I take it?
That's fine. I mean, I think I bet we all have something to say about that. So I can start. I think the Biden administration, I'm of the opinion that Biden has approached American and Western involvement, to the extent we can call it that, in the conflict in a very prudent and I think correct way. The question from the beginning has been to control escalation. Right now, the United States and the West enjoy control over the narrative, and Putin is trying very hard to recover that. And all he needs is for the United States and the West to escalate or to blunder in some way, to retain control of the narrative of being the victim, of being on the defense, of being able to say, see, I told you, they're coming after us, they're expanding. And so I think Biden and NATO in general have to play their cards very carefully here, so as to retain control of that narrative, because unity in sanctions, for example, really depends on it. Being able to hold this global coalition together really depends on it. No-fly zone, I think the logic of avoiding that, a no-fly zone is something that in my mind is morally important and strategically indefensible. It's not something that, if you're trying to control escalation, that you can do in this conflict. We have, for example, in our minds, easily accessible examples of no-fly zones that have been effective, at least in the short run. For example, in Iraq in the 1990s, Libya in 2011. But these were all with respect to countries that didn't have nuclear weapons, that were vastly inferior to ours in terms of technology, in terms of training and readiness. And so I think that the imposition of a no-fly zone is basically an act of war, because if you're going to impose a no-fly zone, you have to enforce a no-fly zone. And that means being ready to shoot down enemy aircraft, enemy air defenses. And that means inevitably at some point, NATO is going to be launching airstrikes into Russian territory. And so you have got a declaration of war just around the corner with a no-fly zone. And you have to ask yourself, is the cost worth the benefit? Maybe in the short run, we are defending civilians, but in the long run, we are widening and deepening an already very destructive conflict. So it's not clear to me that a no-fly zone is the most direct or efficient path to reducing the destructiveness of this conflict. And let's remember, sanctions do hurt a lot. They hurt a lot. I think it's important, just because they are not a visible and tangible, they don't take the form of a battalion tactical group marching across towns, but they are hurting Putin where they need to hurt him. And so I think that this is a calculated and very significant response. And I think that a no-fly zone would only make a very bad situation worse.
Thank you, Anthony. Paul, please.
Yeah, I'll just add two quick things on that. Absolutely agree with the way Anthony just phrased that. I think just to kind of sum up that last bit, if your choice as an opponent to Russia at this point, from a geopolitical perspective, was I can either A, somehow manage to enforce a no-fly zone, or B, keep the global coalition together on sanctions, the sanctions are a much more powerful chess piece, right? The other thing I think to think about is, and I'm thinking about in terms of Biden being quite a a military conflict averse leader, probably the most averse leader since Carter. Voted for the Iraq War as a senator, but clearly regrets it. Came of political age during the Vietnam conflict. Lots of reasons to be thinking wars never end the way you think they're going to. But NATO has to be this red line, regardless of some quasi status. And Anthony's right to bring that up, but in terms of Putin's thinking, but you are in NATO at some point, at which point that is Biden's red line. Well, that's one thing if Putin attacks Poland. But if there is even a distracting incursion into Lithuania, that is tactically a nightmare for NATO, trying to defend Lithuania. So anything that increases the chances that this becomes a Russian-NATO conflict brings up a whole lot of very, very difficult military maneuvers. I mean, a massive insertion of US military power into Lithuania within a few weeks, that's a difficult thing to do, right? So anything that discusses why isn't the United States and Europe doing more militarily has to come up against not only nuclear weapons, but also significant continental-wide conflicts of really varied varied military landscape. So yeah, I see comments by people about, why isn't the United States doing more? And, these atrocities and war crimes and so on. and it's very, very heartbreaking to have to say it, but this is not a conflict that the United States can become directly involved in.
And I would add to that, right? Become directly involved and make it somehow better all the way around. It just seems like it would get much, much worse, much longer. But that gets us to the end game question, which I am going to ask in just a couple minutes. It's 7:14, and I'm trying to get a couple more questions in here, and there are so many coming in, more than I can handle. But I did want to get to something that actually stuck out in my brain. It's a way to bring Karl back into the conversation. And it was a question relatively early on from someone who has just recently been in Poland and in Ukraine. And they said, look, there are neo-Nazi groups, militias in the Ukraine. I mean, so why, so where there's a disconnect between kind of what you said about it being about the symbolic language and the particulars. So if you could react to that.
Yeah, and I kind of was scanning through the questions as well. And I think the part of that discussion was, well, there's also these, alt-right groups that are in these other countries. There's some that exist in the Russian Federation as well. And why are they not calling out those or and this, that, and the other? And, the reality is this is a very common tactic that we have seen time and time again, going back to the Soviet Union. Even the example I gave in my talk about, at the same time that the Soviets are accusing the Israelis of being Nazis, they themselves are having heaped upon them these claims of anti-Semitism. And the immediate response from every leader at the top of the Kremlin was, there's no anti-Semitism in the Soviet Union, period. They just flat out deny it. And that is totally not the reality. And it's the same situation here, that it is just a common tactic to just deny. If we don't talk about it, it doesn't exist. We're certainly not going to talk about it on our airwaves. Therefore, it is not a problem. The only place that we see, this Nazi issue is in Ukraine. That's kind of the short answer. I'm trying to leave time for all the other questions.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
Well, I think maybe the thing to do, I'm realizing we've got these great questions, enough sufficiently that I'm going to almost suggest, this is a little too much and the rest of you are going to get mad at me, but I'm going to almost suggest we have to do this again in a couple of weeks or a month or 6 weeks, if that's what we're looking at with the Ukraine war, because there's so much more to talk about. The geopolitical aspect of it, the regional aspect of it, for the Balkans part of it, the history, and again, the sort of perspective of Putin. But what I'd like to do is really have each of you, if you could, talk about where this goes from here. And I know the historian doesn't like to project into the future, but I'm basically saying, where is this headed? What does this mean for future relationships between the Ukraine and Belarus? It was mentioned in one of the questions, but also just what does this mean in the region? When is this war going to be done is part of the question, really. So again, hoping to hear from all of you. We're going to use the remaining time to talk about this. Anyone want to go first? Anthony, please.
I'll go. When is the war going to be done? Not soon. That's the easy answer. What we know is that the best predictor of the future is unfortunately yesterday, and I think that's particularly true in this conflict. Russia is entering phase 2 of its conflict in Ukraine. Okay, and it's just beginning. It's regrouping, it's reframing, it's focusing on the Donbass region. So this is not likely to end anytime soon in terms of the war in a very general sense. But if we're thinking about the end game and what some sort of negotiated settlement looks like, we have to ask, what does each side want? Putin clearly wants, or at least he has made the public commitment toward it. He wants no NATO membership for Ukraine. It's hard to see any compromise on that, given how publicly and how clearly he has stated this as a purpose, regardless of whether we believe that it is sincere or insincere on some level. He has made this, a core claim that it would be politically difficult for him to walk back from at this point. But then again, what form does that take? Does that take the form of a constitutional provision? I don't see that happening in Ukraine. Does it take the form of a looser treaty obligation? This is more likely. But then we have to pivot to, what does Ukraine want? Clearly, Ukraine wants Russia out, but how far out, right? Donbass may ultimately be low-hanging fruit to a degree, since there's a larger percentage of ethnic Russians in this region. Ironically, however, Russian brutality in eastern Ukraine may threaten to undermine the ease of even this. realistically, I think Putin is likely to sign a treaty that involves some degree of explicit distance between Ukraine and NATO. What form that takes is still unclear. And I think the fate of the Donbass region is likely to remain a frozen conflict into the foreseeable future. I'd be very surprised if that question and conflict is settled. I think Putin loses nothing. Putin loses nothing from solving that in a way that Ukraine lacks. He gains nothing from that. So retreat from this position just seems politically impossible for Putin, because it is basically an admission of defeat and failure. So important unknowns, I think, are Putin's ability to survive sanctions. That's a very big variable that we really don't understand, and I would stress and reiterate Paul's really good points on that. These are having a very big effect, and we're only now starting to get a glimmer of just how deeply they're being felt by the Russian elite, by Putin specifically. We also have yet to really understand what the role of China is and will be in the future. I really liked that Paul emphasized the economic asymmetry between China and Russia. This is something that I try and remind my students of as well. So on the one hand, it would be very easy for China to help Russia. On the other hand, it's not clear that China has a lot to gain from helping Russia. And so I think that China is a bit of a variable there in some ways, and maybe Paul wants to flesh that out a bit further in these final moments. And I think finally, the most important unknown is Western will and commitment to sustaining these sanctions, because by the way, they hurt us as well.
Thank you, Anthony. Paul?
Should I pick up from there maybe? And I'll try not to go too long, but then others might bring it back more specifically to Ukraine and Eastern Europe. But first end game, or where we will be, I think as we go into winter of 2022, we may be talking about what we've managed to put in place to aid European natural gas needs, as well as oil, what the United States can do, and they can do more, but it involves things like changing the contracts for LNG tankers, politically, changing those contracts. But I just want to take a minute or 2 minutes and talk about the importance of the Chinese-Russian relationship and how it might change if, in fact, the Chinese Communist Party does decide to support Putin going forward and to really take countermeasures to sanctions. It will have to do so by essentially buying large portions of the Russian economy. And internally within China, Chinese state capital or quasi-state capital is not going to be willing to do that unless it gets unless it is able to buy these Russian assets at bargain basement prices. So just to give an example, if a US oil company has stranded a project to develop oil fields in Russia, and the Russians need capital to ramp that back up, and wants to get that capital from China, they're going to have to give the Chinese players substantial economic control over those Russian oil fields. So I mentioned Indonesia and Brazil a few moments ago. China takes a peripheral view of minor countries in its region, and seeing Russia and how Russia could fit into the Chinese perception of its periphery is something that China would be willing to talk about, and Russian elites might find horrifying. And at that point, there's a different kind of pressure on Putin. Are you really going to sell us to the Chinese? But I think that in terms of the most likely endgame there, that probably would be it. If Putin is able to remain in power and the Russian military is able to remain in Ukraine, more and more of the Russian economy will come under Chinese control.
Thank you, Paul. Carolyn, looks like you're ready to jump in. So
I don't want to prognosticate, because I think it's such a highly fluid situation right now that it's hard to figure out what is going to happen in the next couple of days. But I do want to emphasize something that several of my peers have mentioned, which is how significant these economic sanctions are in terms of having an effect on Russia and then on Putin's actions, and how remarkable it is that Europe has really come together, with the exception of Serbia, in sort of signing on to these sanctions. And so I think that in a couple of months, we're going to really see how effective they've been in pushing Putin to trying to end this. But I foresee a long, protracted engagement of Russia in Ukraine. I think it's going to be really very hard for him to get out because he's so dug in, and there's so much in terms of his personality at risk here in this conflict. So I don't have an answer to that, but I do think that it is important to look at sort of how remarkable the response has been at this point from the West and the effect it's had on the conflict.
Thank you, Carolyn. Karl.
Okay, well, I'm going to be, I guess, the optimist for Ukraine. You know, I guess I see two outcomes. You know, first, I think set against the backdrop is the I think surprising effort and success the Ukrainian army has had against a mostly conscript Russian army. And the fact that they have held out this long, they continue to be able to take on an offensive, I think speaks volumes of their capabilities. And to what my colleagues have been saying here, this is going to be protracted, and if we're, well, this may come across as crass. If we're lucky, perhaps Putin runs out the biological clock. He's going to be 70 this year. The life expectancy of Russians is not that great for men. But I would also suggest maybe a second alternative, and I've made this comment. I know some of my students are watching tonight. In the 20th century, at three different moments, when poor economics, a poor war, and a lot of social unrest occurs in the Russian Federation, or at least in Russian history, there have been revolutions. And we could be approaching that. I'm not going to try to predict that it is, but the sanctions are certainly having an effect on those that I communicate with directly in the Russian Federation. And they were immediate. We're talking about personal, financial savings gone in a day. The run on banks, what little cash is left is starting to run dry. The stores are running bare. There's no sense of what the cost of goods are. You cannot buy things. Life for the average citizen has shut down. There's the social unrest, and you have a conscript army that's fighting a war, mostly who don't know why they're there to begin with. Those are bad things, and the Russians have a history of having revolution when those things occur. So we could be heading that direction, I guess. And I did see one thing in the chat here that I guess I'll wrap with this. I've said it a few times again in I think closer circles, that I think the key to watch here is Navalny. I said it when the war broke out. Watch what happens to Navalny. I could see Putin trying to make a martyr of him if things really start to go sour. And we've seen step one of that, I believe, already, with him being resentenced and sent off to yet another distant prison. So to the person that asked that question, that's my I guess final say there is keep your eyes on Navalny to see what happens.
Well, thank you, Karl, and thanks to everybody at this point. It is, according to my clock, 7:28, and we do need to finish up. I am going to make one last comment as the moderator. I have the power to do so. And that really connects back to what Karl was just saying about unrest, the social unrest in Russia itself. I teach a class on media and politics, and we've been talking a lot about disinformation in Russia by the Russian government. But we also live in a very different communication technology age, and social media has changed, and the ability to access information has changed. And I am really curious right now how much information is making it into Russia from the West. The suggestion by many is it very little, but I am curious about that, because that feeds into the unrest. I think that the knowledge that their own army is not doing as well as people expected in Ukraine, and that the rest of the world is watching and is sanctioning for the purposes that the rest of the group have just laid out. I think that's going to be interesting to keep an eye on. Okay, but that was my small comment. Thanks to all of the audience members first for all of the amazing questions. Just a lot of rich stuff. Jamie, I'm hoping we're going to be able to capture some of these questions that came in the Q&A. If there's some sort of file I can get my hands on, that would be great, because I just want to keep those in mind. And we can maybe talk about doing something else, but I don't know when, because we got to finish this semester first, and we're pretty close to the end of it. So again, the questions keep coming in. It's incredible. But I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank Anthony and Karl and Paul and Carolyn, especially for coming and joining us on Zoom from far, far away. And I want to again thank the Fort Vancouver Regional Library for their help in making this happen. We really appreciated being here. We look forward to seeing all of you at some point in person and in Zoom as needed, right? So that is the plan. So thank you. Thanks to all. Good night. It is 7:30 and we're out of here.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.
Take care.